And welcome back to Dukascopy TV. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Frank Hollenbeck is back in the studio with us to give us a bit of a market overview. Dr. Frank, welcome back.
Good to see you again, Monica.
A pleasure to have you as always. Okay, so Dr. Frank, let's kick things off straight away with the US, shall we? Now, things seem to be, gaining momentum. The GDP grew at its fastest in 8 years. We had that strong figure on Friday from the employment figures. So, yeah, it seems to be rosy, but what is your take on it, Dr. Frank?
Well, it is true that the president and members of his party have been somewhat crowing about the improvements in the U.S. economy. And there's something I've always said is fear the boom, not the bust. In other words, is this improvement broad-based? Is it based on a strong showing in the increase in purchase of plant and equipment? And the answer is no. Actually today, the average age of plant and equipment in the US is the oldest it's been on record. Okay? And in reality, where the improvements are coming is in the same areas that got us into trouble in the first place. Okay? That's housing and autos. Okay? When we look at total outstanding loans, okay, auto loans, okay, they currently stand at $924.2 billion. That's a 10.8 increase over last year. Okay? And most of that improvement, though, has been in auto loans to people who have relatively poor credit scores. For example, people with credit scores over 760, there's been basically no increase in the outstanding number of auto loans. It's all been for credit scores under 760. And when we look at subprime auto loans, those with very bad credit, and that's basically credit scores under 640, we can see that this year, 31%, actually 31.2% of the subprime auto loans have been, 31.2% of the auto loans have been subprime auto loans. And actually, we have about 27.8% of all auto loans are subprime. So if we have a rise in interest rates, we may end up with, a very similar thing we saw in housing, where it was subprime lenders that basically went under, and we may see now subprime auto lenders go under.
Now, so something else that I've been looking forward to getting your take on, Dr. Frank, is obviously the European side of things. We had that meeting last week, and really the disappointment from Mario Draghi and the ECB playing down that previous pledge, it would have seemed, to expand the balance sheet of the bank. Yeah, the markets were disappointed, but what was your reaction?
Well, if you look at Article 104 of the Maastricht Treaty, it clearly states that the ECB is prohibited from purchasing any debt instruments, okay, not just government bonds, okay. But then again, European countries have found that following rules is not one of the things they're best at. For example, they never held to the 3% deficit targets, nor did they ever hold to the 60% debt to GDP ratio targets. So if the ECB starts buying government bonds and violates the Maastricht Treaty, that would not surprise me. But what we're seeing in Europe is basically, two opposite camps. We have, France, Italy, and Spain, who would like to see more quantitative easing because they would love for the ECB to monetize their debt. And on the other hand, you have Germany, who's experienced this all before, okay, back in 1921-23, and knows that that ultimately this will lead to hyperinflation. Okay, and we have to remember how the ECB was created. The reason Germany was willing to accept entering into the euro is basically the price for reunification with East Germany. But one of the conditions that Germany imposed was that it would be basically like the Bundesbank. It would be a hard currency central bank. And now they're finding out that it's not a Bundesbank. And I wouldn't be surprised that sometime in the future, okay, I'd say relatively soon, okay, that Merkel will come out and say, look, if the ECB starts monetizing the debt, then we're going to go back to the Deutschmark, okay? And when that happens, we'll have a financial crisis, okay? okay? Because there's no way you can avoid the fact that what will happen is you'll have hyperinflation in Europe, and it's just very, very likely. And we can see, you know, Germany they're not really happy about this purchasing of asset-backed securities. Commentators have indicated that it's basically, you know, creating a bad bank out of the ECB, and the head of the Bundesbank basically said this is, you know, just printing money, which is basically a tax on cash balances.
Okay, now Dr. Frank, in that answer there you mentioned the word crisis, and according to the 16th Geneva report, that might be closer than we actually seem. Now they point out government debt and personal debt being over leveraged, and the true situation isn't really being foretold. They say that crisis is indeed looming. What do you think?
Well, we're trying to solve a debt crisis with more debt. Okay, and if we look at Europe, we basically have had almost no growth in Europe. And actually, that's really not quite surprising. Okay, what's been happening is that we've had a small decline in private sector lending, but it's been more than compensated by an increase in government borrowing. Okay, and when we look at European governments, when we look at government expenditures as a percentage of GDP, is basically going up in every European country. Well, what does that mean? That means that the public sector is basically getting larger relative to the private sector in Europe. So essentially, what's happening in Europe is we're heading toward communist Cuba instead of heading toward Singapore. Okay, what we need to do is massive cuts in government spending, reduce the size of government, free up resources, put those resources into the private sector, and it's the private sector that will lead us to growth. But unless we have, you know, a financial crisis, an economic crisis, I don't think that's going to occur.
Okay, well, it's certainly something worth the watching, Dr. Frank. Thank you so much for coming in and sharing your sights in with us. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Okay, well, that's all from Dr. Frank and myself for another Hollenbeck Unleashed. But make sure you keep clicking back to Dukascopy TV for many more exclusive interviews. Goodbye for now.